Welcome back to another episode of Real Talk, everyone. I hope that everyone is doing quite well, wherever you may be listening and watching this right now. If you are new to the channel, you will know that these videos are short, rather impromptu discussions on things that are currently going on, both politically, spiritually, philosophically, and whatever else I find that I need to get off my chest without necessarily taking the time to write an essay and combining it with one of my favorite hobbies of all time, that of fishing. I wanted to speak of sorts on a continuation of a series of ideas that I've been currently working on and writing about. Recently, there was a Substack post I put out about the politics of the eternal now, or the perils of presentism. For those unfamiliar, presentism is both a literary and historical tool that is used to apply modern-day morals, teachings, and understandings of the world back onto the past. And this, of course, is used as an effective form, politically speaking, as a method of political erasure of history. It is done so that we are always focused on the eternal now. We must always look at the lens of the world by now, through now, both the past and the future, whatever utopia or future that one may imagine, especially more so on the political left than the right, will inevitably solve the problems of the now, but our social issues, our virtue signaling, and our ideals will be ever present in the now of the future. This place of presentism not only serves as a format of political and historical and cultural erasure, that in we must look back on things where men who had camaraderie or saw each other as great friends or even foes on the battlefield were secretly latent homosexuals, the idea that somehow everything must be a stand-in for our current culture war and all things must be politicized by the present mechanisms and methods of our history in order to ensure that really a better world could not be documented. You see this quite often, at least mimetically speaking, when it comes to things like the 1950s and 60s, that actually know the economic prosperity that may have been there at the time really didn't actually exist. We were a nation of drinkers, we were a nation of wife-beaters, racists, secretly keeping people in the closet, etc., etc. Television shows like AMC's Mad Men, I think, are a very good example of this. However, in the avenues of erasure, there are individuals, I think, trying to find an answer out of this world, out of this current dialogue or Plato's cave of the ongoing recurring discourse of the now, and how do we escape the now, and what do we do in order to ensure that the future, nothing at all of the future, looks like what today actually has to show us. And that's a fair question. Obviously, we can see this push, at least online and in writings and from the wealthy, pursuing sort of an effective altruism or an effective accelerationism, both on the left and the right, about what do we do in order to escape our problems. The techno-optimism has certainly seen the underlying realities of how civilizations work. It requires competence, it requires discipline, and it requires you to overcome the ongoing problems of today so that the future doesn't have to deal with them and that the current problem might be able to be solved. The problem with that, however, is that it will always be attacking the underlying beliefs of the ongoing progressive presentism that we deal with, specifically when it comes to the nature of our technology. Specifically, we can look at Elon Musk, who has not only lost billions of dollars in his lawsuits with the federal government, but is also being attacked for a variety of reasons, one of them being about not hiring refugees and asylum seekers, even though the laws that are on the books right now for individuals who have contracts with the Department of Defense prevent him from doing just that. So again, you can kind of see how the diversity, equity, and inclusion world that we live in, the worship of the rising tide of color, we're to say, is now a national security threat and a threat to one man's wealth and livelihood. But there is this underlying facet of the culture war that exists specifically with technology that serves both as a distraction, potentially escapism, but another fault line in the ever-growing fractures and divide of the American culture war, which unfortunately is the United States' biggest export to the rest of the world. When you have a lingua franca of Valley Californian Esperanto-style English that determines the progressive cultures and mores, where others, individuals in other countries whose language is nothing like English at all, are using English to speak to one another in the midst of intercourse due to the profligation of pornography everywhere, one begins to realize that technology will be at the epicenter of the emerging culture wars of the future. Of course, the battles that we are fighting now, progressives will carry over into virtually everything, as will the right, because we are locked in this dyad of political and cultural conflict that too many people, I don't think, realize isn't just for making money or getting clicks, but to a large extent these conflicts are, as all political conflicts are, existential whether one realizes it or not. But the direction that we see when it comes to technology, whether it be about cybernetics, whether it be about our content-focused worldviews, where we look forward to the parasociality as a means not only of control, but as we can see through our own political discourse, avenues in which the state can use to control specific talking points to make sure that this idea of the Overton window isn't pushed too far in either direction, but is successfully contained that way. There is numerous research, white papers, think tanks, that all write on these specific issues. The growing sentiment about abandoning smartphones or trying to avoid technology altogether is a form of neo-Ludditism, or whatever you want to call it, that's emerged as of late, specifically within more religious communities I've noticed more than ever, or those that simply really wish to embody the idea of, I just want to be left alone. Political realism tells me that that's not going to work in the long run. I'm a firm believer that lest we experience some kind of black swan event of a force majeure or an act of God, that technology is still going to be here for a while. Now, obviously, this means that the Tower of Babel for the digital age will inevitably be constructed, and it probably already is here with our social media and the internet, but even then, we're still thankfully blocked off by culture, language, and reason. At least in that sense, I don't have to know what on earth is going on in Japanese Twitter, despite how many people try and translate it and put it on my timeline feed, simply because it's not my place to know, let alone care about what's going on in Japan. I have enough problems as it is when it comes to taking a look at what's happening here in my own home country in the United States, and my own home area, which is the state of Texas. This techno-optimism versus techno-pessimism, I think, is really going to emerge as people try to look for answers to avoiding the politics of the eternal now. If the perils of presentism, this hermeneutical tool that our current modern life has to deal with day in and day out, where everyone secretly had their own relationships and debauchery as far back under the patriarchal and racist eras of just the recent past of the turn of the 20th century, well then we can already see it being applied to erase all forms of history both in antiquity and throughout the early modern era. With that being said, I think that this culture war dynamic that is going to emerge is going to be about how can we utilize this technology for our own perspective wins. There has already been a lot of discussion on the Chris Rufo front about plagiarism and the rest, about using large language models and artificial intelligence to help detect plagiarism and to utilize it against progressive foes to try and defund them. Now, everything about this, of course, highlights asymmetrical warfare, something that we're already beginning to witness along in the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea between the Houthis and the United States Navy, that they can send relatively cheap, disposable drones and other munitions up against multi-million-dollar equipment. A war of financial attrition, so to speak, wherein the taxpayer dollars are now spending millions upon millions of dollars in contracts, RFPs, refueling, docking, etc., versus a smaller funded group that doesn't have the same level of technological capabilities. Now, of course, there are things to address, such as the geopolitical situation of escalation, the rules of engagement, etc., but it does illustrate that all conflicts here on out are going to be asymmetrical. The discussion of trying to run away, a neo-Luddism that is going to say, well, I'm just going to wipe my hands of this and not deal with the current problem and be as disconnected as possible, has two avenues that come to my mind. One that explicitly states, I reject this for the good of my soul, the good of my mind, the good of my sanity, the ultimate form of the McLuhan idea of auto-amputation. We are going to just cut it off and not bother. You can even see this on the Twitter timeline when people say nothing ever happens. To some extent, they are right. Nothing ever really does happen. But then again, they also say that because that's another piece of information they can just cut off from themselves and not consider it in their Weltanschauung or their analytical worldview for what's going on in the world. At the same time, I think it is also a likely avenue that people will run away from it in some sort of, Rod Dreyer kind of way of, trying to take a Benedict option, but with technology. But again, political realism, just as we can see when it comes to nuclear weapons, geopolitical control over hegemony, that you can't really run away from your problems. You have to inevitably confront them, or at least come up with some kind of personal solution that will address those issues. However, it will be an ongoing conflict for many years to come, in which all forms of our current culture war will inevitably inhabit. Years ago, when I was in college, I distinctly remember listening to a lecture on the earliest forms of deepfakes and what might be used in elections. Specifically, they were talking about the usage, for instance, of all the sort of vocal synthesizers to create fake Jordan Peterson lines, which were once quite popular on YouTube some years ago, almost a decade really at this point, that are now very, very hard to find. However, now with Beta 11 labs and all sorts of other technology, both open sourced and to pay for it, you can generate virtually anything. And we've noticed that quite effectively on Twitter and those using it for more hilarious purposes. Think Dagoth and Morrowind copypasta edits. However, this is also going to lead to an ongoing level of schizophrenia in our body politic. One wherein the now, the royal in, I guess you could say for that word, wherein everything that we deal with now will be explored in through all lenses and all frames of our technology, and we can manufacture that for you wholesale if you'd like, a specifically formatted political narrative that will fit whatever you need based upon our technology that can support it. You kind of already saw this with the whole He Gets Us advertisements that came up during the Super Bowl, wherein obviously very non-Christian groups were using Jesus' washing of the disciples' feet in order to make a point about racism or some other kind of progressive shibboleth that they bow down to. But a lot of the artwork that was generated for that advertisement was clearly generated with some sort of stable diffusion or image generation based upon these LLMs and other models for the image's creation. Now, I am no expert on this, Lord knows that I'm not, and I can tell you exactly what not to do in life, which is what I did, get 2 liberal arts degrees. What I can say, however, is that the reality of our current culture war will inevitably spread, as it does with all forms of cancer. It will metastasize onto new mediums and onto new media and the platforms that come with it. The distraction, or the form of escapism that will inevitably come with this new front of techno-optimism versus techno-pessimism, really does come back to something that I have commented on earlier on another Real Talk video, actually, the bottleneck wars. This is going to be part of those great filters. Some of us will obviously make it through, and we will learn to adapt with the technology. Others will completely auto-amputate themselves from specific platforms or mediums. I do this myself already. I'm not on TikTok, I'm not on Facebook or Instagram, and I don't see myself ever really going on them. Perhaps I should for the sake of decentralization and adapting rather than dying, but that is a bridge I will inevitably have to cross myself. You already know my position on a lot of these issues. I uninstall Twitter during the weekends, where I'm only tweeting if I'm on my desktop or I have something scheduled. But at the same time, these culture war fronts are going to stay for some time. They make for excellent distraction, they make for great talking points, and it allows the left hand to never really know what the right hand is doing when it comes to us bickering over things like Sydney Sweeney or Taylor Swift or some kind of film when the present reality is still right in front of us. Things are incredibly bleak, politically, economically, and spiritually. Our friends across the pond, of course, are dealing with a form of colonialization that is both digitally from Silicon Valley, spiritually and culturally from the Third World, and the same thing happening here in America where the border is overrun. The Second Amendment apparently now applies to military-aged men who have come here illegally, and at the same time, we're all wondering, can someone truly build the rocket that will get us out of here? Will there be some kind of digital oasis, the kind of Zion that one might think of from The Matrix? I'm not too sure if that's going to be the case, as when it comes to all forms of a matrix or some kind of escapism, it really doesn't stop you from getting mugged on the street. It doesn't really stop you from noticing things that everyone knows are wrong. It's not going to stop you from realizing that the economy has been restructured in a way where the majority inhabitants of a country aren't being hired, but instead anyone who comes from outside that nation is prioritized first, with the codes, the programs, and the models all telling you to accept that frame because it's always been that way, and it will always be that way for ages to come. More, of course, has to be looked at on this, and I don't want this to be my last thoughts, but I wanted to get this out here for you all, especially as spring comes around, and I look outside and I see the beautiful weather, the blooming flowers and plants and trees, as life emerges once again in my little country home. It's a beautiful distraction, but I also know that you can't stay away from the world forever. Not all of us are going to be monks and hermits who simply do abandon this world and take up everything and leave. It's important to realize that the next phase, or the next avenue, or the next front of this culture will be over the very scrying mirrors that we carry in our pockets all the time. I guess the question is really going to be, how self-aware are we? How much are we going to be playing into the frame of an enemy, the frame of a talking head paid by some agency, whether private or public, and all of a sudden find ourselves in discursive battles that are going to be generated for the sake of distraction, entertainment, identifying points that have nothing really to do with what's going on, but for the sake of clout or parasociality, that's what we're going to be discussing today. We can't escape the eternal now, at least for right now. We will need to find a way to abandon that frame. Clearly, the reality and the situation on the ground is what's going to matter, because as the new technologies emerge to erase the past, change the future, and own the present, the thing that is going to matter now so more than anything is being able to look around, record it accurately, to make sure that your lying eyes are what you believe in, not what you see on screen. More videos to come, more thoughts to come on this, written and fleshed out in a more essay-based format, but I wanted to take this time and opportunity to get my thoughts out now rather than later. I hope that you are enjoying the weather wherever you may be, and that you are all doing quite well in this springtime. God bless, take care, and be prudent, everyone. I'll see you all next time.